So are you ready to go? Okay, thanks for coming on this nice and balmy Saturday evening in Cambridge. And I should also say hello to, I know there's a few people watching in Tasmania. So good morning to those in Tasmania as well. I see a few familiar faces in the audience, as some of you might have seen me before. My name's Clive Boddy. I've been researching the effects of corporate psychopaths on employees, organisations and society since 2005. So I suppose that's 21 years by now. Today I'm looking more specifically at the issue of whether they'd cause a global financial crisis in exchange for a large monetary bonus for themselves. Some of you who were around in 2008 might already know the answer to this question, but we'll explore it anyway. So this is my third Cambridge Festival talk. The first one was on psychopaths and the impetus to power. And this basically illustrated that psychopaths in powerful situations as leaders, and political leaders in particular, have really driven many of the events of world history. And I'll go through a couple of those slides to refresh you of that. The second one last year looked at the issue of female psychopaths, and we realized that there's a lot more female psychopaths than we thought there were. Still more males and more severe in males, but that was another interesting finding. And today we look at the global financial crisis. At no extra cost, I've added a few extra slides as I was waiting here tonight. And the first one, it really explains the origins of psychopaths. So why do some of them end up in prison and some of them end up in the corporate sector? And as you'd expect, it really depends on the socio-economic background of the people, their educational opportunities, whether their families can protect them from their misdemeanors as children without them being criminalized or put into some part of the legal system. And of course, things like intelligence as well, I suppose, play a part. So, as I said, some from disadvantaged backgrounds might end up in prisons, some from advantaged backgrounds might end up in the corporate sector. Psychopaths in history go right back to Ivan the Terrible and beyond. Hitler was diagnosed as a psychopath in 1933 by a Norwegian professor of psychiatry in Norway, as you'd expect. Goering is a bit more interesting than Hitler because he was a narcissist as well as a psychopath, and I've written a paper on him. He reminds me of Trump quite a lot because he wants to be liked and not just feared. Psychopaths want to be feared. Narcissists want to be admired, at least by their core supporters as well. Muammar Gaddafi was identified as psychopathic. Those of you who saw my original presentation will know that his troop of female bodyguards that he had with him all the time were actually hostages. So these were from the leading Libyan families, and he kept them with them so that if those families stage a coup, he could just execute their daughters. He also abused them in various ways, as you can imagine. Saddam and Uday, his son, were also highly psychopathic. They found a torture chamber below the palace, and Saddam used to take Uday down for a bit of torture on an average morning, poking people with iron bars, that kind of thing. And Robert Maxwell and Ghislaine. Ghislaine, of course, has been in the press recently because of her conviction for trafficking. There's 2 points I want to make here. One is, and I've written a paper on Robert, but not on Ghislaine. One is there's a hereditary element to psychopathy, so there's a genetic element. And the other one is there's a socialization element. So if you're the child of a psychopath, you'll get more abuse than average. And that might be enough abuse to brutalize you so that you behave in a psychopathic way yourself. So Ghislaine, for example, got hit on the back of the hand when she was a child with a hammer by Robert, her dad, when she was misbehaving, and that's not normal disciplined behavior. King John was identified as one of the worst probably the worst king we've ever had in the UK. So he used to take advantage of his nobles' wives and daughters, not a good person to invite for dinner. And he was cruel and merciless and ruthless. So in the end, they forced him to sign Magna Carta, and that was one of the positive elements of psychopathic leadership, that we do in the end react against it, albeit usually too late. And there's a great historian we had at Anglia-Ruskin, and I've forgotten his name now, but he described Trump's first presidency as being like a royal court. So he doesn't run the place as a president, he runs it as a king, and that's the power. I think he's actually said he'd like to be a despot. Is leadership important? Yes, I think this picture says that. And many of the people on here score very highly on measures of psychopathy. So Trump has been identified as narcissistic and sociopathic, some people use that word, and psychopathic. Putin the same, except not narcissistic. Hitler, as I said, was identified in 1933 or diagnosed by a psychiatrist. The rest of them are good candidates. These are the similar bunch of people, I should say, from organizational life. So those of you who are as old as me will remember the top three are the top three guys from Enron Corporation. So Lay, Fasto, and Skilling. On the bottom, Robert Maxwell again. To the left, Al Dunlop, and to the right, Bernie Madoff. All identified as sociopathic and or psychopathic, and all involved in fraud in the end. That's what they were caught for. So Robert Maxwell stole from his pension fund. Bernie Madoff's investment vehicle was entirely fictitious as a Ponzi scheme. Al Dunlop fired thousands of workers across Middle America, and largely people like him caused the populism that we see these days, because once you close the factories down and people have got no jobs, they become more and more extreme in their search for some sort of redemption. So he walked away with, I think it was $100 million. He destroyed more or less Sunbeam Corporation and to a large extent Scott Paper as well. So thousands of people lost their jobs. Factories were closed right across America. And in the end, he was fined for fraud, but it was only, I think, what was it, a small amount compared to how much he'd got, maybe $1 million or something like that. And he basically got away with it. They all usually get away with it. The Enron people were imprisoned. Maxwell fell off a yacht, and Bernie Madoff ended his life in prison. He was in prison for 150 years, I think, was his sentence. So the second presentation was about female psychopaths, and we established that the ratio, instead of being about 4 to 1 that we previously thought, is more like 1.2 to 1. So 1.2 males for every female psychopath, but their behavior is slightly different. So it's more relational and emotional rather than physical and violent. And then we come on to today's, which is about the global financial crisis. In terms of the extent of the problem, at a categorical level, around 1% of people are psychopathic. So this is a measure from England. So given a margin of error, it's 0.6 to 1.2. But on top of that, according to Levinson's figures, 23% of males and 6% of females are psychopathic enough to be problematic to society. Particularly, I would argue, if they are badly led. So if you end up with a psychopath in power, then that facilitates and allows to flourish the psychopathy in those who are slightly less psychopathic. Because their bad behaviour is not squashed down or limited. In my more recent research, using Levinson's measure, so using exactly the same measure he did, I got 29% of males and 19% of females in a white-collar sample. So he was using a student sample, I was using a white-collar sample, so mine is more appropriate to the question of corporate psychopathy rather than psychopathy in the general population. So in a way, you'd expect slightly higher figures from my findings. Psychopathy seems to be based in brain irregularities and abnormalities relative to non-psychopathic people. And basically, if you give or you expose someone to emotional stimuli, the areas of the brain that light up in most of us don't light up, don't react in psychopaths. And it's basically to do with the orbitofrontal cortex, which is this bit here, and then going down into the stem and into the amygdala, which is known as the seat of emotion, or sometimes the reptilian part of the brain. And it's that connectivity and chemistry and reactivity that illustrates the presence of a psychopathic brain, because they just don't react to emotional stuff. So the person that's done a lot of research into the brain is this guy Blair, and he says that the basis of the personality is an uncaring attitude towards others, driven by a lack of conscience, underpinned by a lack of emotion. So the three things are all linked together. This is a quote from a professor of leadership called Nigel Nicholson, who I saw presenting back in 2010 or something like that. And a quote from his book is, once senior management positions are reached, the field of candidates left available is marked by its lack of integrity. The good, the caring, and the honest have long been weeded out. So that means as you go up through a corporate ranks, the good, the caring, and the honest have fallen behind and are down at middle and lower management level. Those at senior level are more and more toxic. And then I think one or two of you might have noticed that in your own careers. So according to Nicholson, the appointment of someone who's more or less toxic by that stage is almost inevitable. It sounds a bit more, perhaps he's being a bit more negative than is totally warranted. But the reason this is important, the reason it is important to understand that psychopaths get to the top is because what do they do when they get there? And they influence organizational performance through this mechanism that Robert Hogan identified. So leader personality, especially if it's toxic in some way, affects your style, and your style affects the attitudes of those who work for you and team functioning. And that, in turn, affects organizational performance. So if you go back to team functioning, you'll see that under toxic leaders, there's a very high, quite often, turnover of personnel. So under Trump's first presidency, for example, the turnover of senior executives in the White House was 3 times faster than it was under Barack Obama. So people can't stand working there with him because of his personality. Another example, we looked at a charity organisation in London some years ago, and we followed it longitudinally using a qualitative sort of, we had an insider basically, so it was sort of ethnographic, I suppose. And once the new leader came in who had distinct psychopathic characteristics, basically everybody left. By everybody, I mean everybody. 100% of people left. Not only that, but the newcomers started to leave as well, because people just can't stand the lack of direction and the abuse and the bullying that goes on, and they leave as quickly as they can. Apologies if you've seen this slide before, but this, I think, is one of the key ones to understanding the problem that we've got. So this is a psychopathy scale on the bottom here. So egocentric, cheating, and untruthful, irresponsible, etc. And on the side is what? Oh, a level of agreement with those attributes. So the problem is, for transformational leaders, so I asked people who had a transformational leader to rate that leader on these psychopathic attributes. And I asked people who had a psychopathic leader to rate their leader on these psychopathic attributes. And you can see there's an obvious, huge difference in terms of egocentricity, cheating, being untruthful, irresponsible, unresponsive, having no remorse, being shallow, and no self-blame. There's a massive difference there, so you can easily see the difference. The problem is the transformational leaders, who are the type of leaders we really need, because they transform not only the trajectories of the organizations and societies they lead, but also of the people within those organizations and societies, are not quite as charming and poised and sociable as psychopathic leaders are when you first meet them. So these psychopathic leaders, they present a facade of charm and poise and rationality and ease, sociability, and therefore they're very likable, and therefore we think they're going to be the transformational leaders that we really want and need. But in actuality, they're quite the opposite. So it's at the selection point where we fail as a society, because our selection is typically shallow in orientation. We look at a CV, we give 1 or 2 interviews, and we base everything on that. We should be probing a lot more deeply into the attitudes of the subordinates of these people, not their superiors, their subordinates. Because they always use upward impression management to manipulate how their superiors see them. So that the superiors see them as star performers. Their subordinates see them as the devil in a suit. So there's a huge difference in this perception. I did more or less the same thing with people who worked for servant leaders. So servant leadership is a bit like transformational leadership, except, if anything, it's a bit more altruistic than transformational leaders are. So again, it's a very positive form of leadership. And again, in terms of being charming and poised and sociable, they're ranked almost the same as psychopathic leaders when you first meet them. So in other words, we can't tell the difference between good leaders and bad leaders at a shallow level. Without going through the hundreds of slides that I normally show people, the psychopathy is associated with these following things. So they couldn't care less about sustainability, I should say. So we've seen a massive change since the new regime came into power in America. And it's not just the political change. Companies are now withdrawing from all their previous climate change commitments, for example, because they never really believed in them in the first place, probably. So psychopaths will engage in fake corporate social responsibility in order to make themselves look good. But if that's no longer a measure of how they'll be evaluated, then, as we can see happening now, they're all dropping it like hot potatoes. So sustainability, they don't care about their families, their future of their families, or the future of anyone else, and therefore sustainability is of no concern to them at all. Crimes against humanity. This guy, Robert Hare, who was one of the pioneers in psychopathy research, but mainly in prison settings, he again looked at some prisoners. This time they were in prison for crimes against humanity. So these were the ex-Pinochet regime, military and policemen, who were in jail for things like throwing people out of helicopters at half a mile up or something. So a nasty, torturing, malicious group of people. He found high levels of psychopathy, but he also found, which was interesting, the higher the rank of the officer, like general or major or captain or colonel on the way downwards, the higher the level of psychopathy. So this ties in with our theory that the higher up you go, the more of them there are, and the better they are at getting to the top. Because he found that correspondence. There's an interesting paper. This woman looked at psychopathy in the famous group of, or one of the famous group of British spies in the Cold War era, and found significant levels of psychopathy. They commit fraud. There's less evidence for this than some of the other things I'm going to talk about. But it's always been expected that they'll commit fraud because they're untruthful, they're egotistical, they're out for themselves. And the interesting paper there is from Jefferson, and he did a study of auditors and found that 69% of auditors think they've come across a corporate psychopath in relation to their careers, usually in association with either fraud or attempted fraud. So we do meet these people in society and in organisations. The other group that is most likely to meet them are HR directors, because they'll have to deal with the abuse and the bullying and the sexual harassment that these people will be accused of. They're quite happy to illegally dump toxic waste material. This is Ryan Jones looking at that. So a direct, significant correlation between those two, psychopathy and dumping toxic waste. And they destroy the effective functioning of organisations in multiple ways. So communications go down, corporate social responsibility goes down, training goes down, and people start to engage in withdrawal behaviour. So they take longer coffee breaks, they come in late, they leave early. They do whatever they can to avoid the presence of the psychopathic manager because it's too abusive and unwelcome an experience. So when I first started to publish about them, I published this paper called the Corporate Psychopaths Theory of the Global Financial Crisis, which basically argued that because these people are interested in money, power, and prestige, they will gravitate towards areas of the economy which give those things. And corporate banking, investment banking, and the financial sector do give those things, and therefore I thought they'd be congregating in that area. So this is still one of my most cited papers, and it generated worldwide attention at the time. And in discussing it, am I jumping ahead of myself? In discussing it, a financial journalist called Brian Basham was talking to a corporate banker, and he said to him, what do you think of this silly theory? And the banker said, in my bank, we used a measure of psychopathy to recruit people. Not to keep them out, but to get them in. So if the bank was good at that, then the number of financial psychopaths in the corporate banking sector might actually be quite large. So the number of studies that have looked at the incidence is very few even now, but the basic figure is this one. So this is Babiak and Hare's figures, more or less. So again, the higher up you go, the more of them there are. And they estimated about 3.9% at the top, 1% at the bottom. But if they're attracted to some areas of industry more than others, then there could be more of them in things like corporate banking, and it might be a distribution like that. And if the banks were good at recruiting psychopaths, then it might be something like that. So once you get 11 or 12% of psychopaths in senior management positions, then the whole culture and climate and ethical norms within the organization will be severely compromised, and it's almost inevitable that you'll get high levels of immoral and possibly illegal behavior. So, and other academics than me find that time after time when they investigate the morality and ethics of corporate banking, they always find it's low, and often abysmally low. So the Australians just had a royal commission into the banking and financial sector industry, and it's a whole catalogue of lies, deception, fraud, illegal activities. It's just unbelievable to read almost. So, if that's all true, then you would expect to find that psychopaths are more motivated by money than other people are. So I've done 2 recent studies which looks at this. The first one looked at their attitudes to money, and the second one, which is about the global financial crisis, looked at whether they'd be happy to create a financial crisis in exchange for a bonus. So the money one first. I'm going to show you a scatter plot in a minute, but before I show you the scatter plot, I'll show you the distribution of psychopathy scores, which is typical in a population. So it's not a normal curve, it's asymmetrical, and most of us have low levels of psychopathy, so down at the bottom of the scale. So that's the male distribution, that's the female distribution. So female, slightly less psychopathic, and again, mostly at the bottom of the scale. So not many people who are very highly psychopathic. So the scatter plot that I want to show you has 2 scales on it. One is the power of money. So this is the Adrian Furnham scale that measures, well, how much you love money, basically. What meaning do you give to money in your life? How do you see it? And the other side of the scale is Levinson's self-report psychopathy scale. So it's a self-report measure of psychopathy. So there's 2 things I think that are worth noticing. The first one is up here, there's nobody. So those who are the lowest in psychopathy are not overwhelmed by their perception of money equaling power and control. Similarly, those down here in the bottom corner who are high in psychopathy, there's no one there who is high in psychopathy who doesn't believe in the power of money. So psychopaths like money more than anyone else does. And I'll show you some basic statistics which examine that in more detail. I took 3 of the elements from Levinson's scale and made it into a subscale which I called materialism. And there's 3 elements that My main purpose in life is getting as many goodies as I can. And you can see 100% of the psychopathic agree with that, compared to only 33% of the non-psychopathic. So in other words, the rest of us are concerned with emotions and relationships and families and children. Psychopaths are concerned with the attainment of materialistic advancement and pleasure. Making a lot of money is my most important goal. 100% of psychopaths agree with that, compared to only 51% of non-psychopaths. And I let others worry about higher values. My main concern is the bottom line. All psychopaths agree with that, only 40% of non-psychopaths. So you can see a very clear orientation towards materialism within the psychopathic. They also have a peculiar view of money, which the rest of us on average don't have. So they think money gives you the power to influence other people. So 100% of them agree with that, compared to 30% of the non-psychopathic. It shows how successful and powerful you are. So most non-psychopaths would want to be judged on non-money, non-materialistic outcomes, not just money. The psychopathic are much more concerned with that. I've always been inspired by powerful tycoons. Most people don't agree with that. All psychopaths do. And money can help you be accepted by others. All psychopaths agree with that. So there's a theory from, I think it must be psychoanalysts, that says psychopaths, because of their emotional deficit, because of their lack of a rich emotional life and meaningful relationships, seek to fill the void by this materialism and the money and the gaining of power as a way of feeling something, because they have a dearth. They're not as sensitive as the rest of us, and therefore they need a greater stimulus to feel the same thing as the rest of us feel. So moving on to the global financial crisis questions. So I asked a series of, or we, I should say, asked a series of 5 questions. So the basic scenario was, if by trading in financial derivatives you could make yourself a bonus of £1 million, how likely would you be to do it under the following circumstances? So, and then 5 scenarios. So the first one, you would cause a global financial crisis and everybody would know that you did it, you personally. The second one, you'd cause a global financial crisis by dealing in financial derivatives, but nobody would know that you did it. And then moving down to the last one, your trading would cause no financial damage to other people. So this is a neutral option. The first 4 all cause some level of damage. The last one doesn't. So these are correlations with the answers to the questions. And in all of the scenarios, in other words, the first 4, where there is financial harm to other people, there's a strong and highly significant correlation between psychopathy and the willingness to engage in that scenario. So it's only when you get to the bottom one here, no financial damage, that relationship breaks down and it becomes, in statistical terms, non-significant. So it's only when you get to that level that there's no relationship between psychopathy and your willingness to trade in financial derivatives. So in the first scenario, 55% of psychopaths would be willing to cause a global financial crisis even if they were identified as the originator of that crisis. So in other words, money is more important to them than reputation and their personal image in the world. When you go to the next scenario, the number goes up to 65% of psychopaths And this is when people wouldn't know that they were identified as the originator of the crisis. And it's only when, at the bottom here, when there's no financial damage at all, that the majority of the non-psychopathic would be willing to engage in financial derivatives training to get this £1 million bonus. Some people haven't engaged with the question, but we're not quite sure why. But maybe they're not interested in money, maybe they don't trust themselves to engage in financial derivatives trading, or maybe they just don't know what that is. So, on average, only the psychopathic are willing to cause a global financial crisis for personal enrichment. Are there actually psychopaths in the financial sector? There's a few sources of evidence for this. One of them was this study by Howe and Falkenbach, and they looked at financial sector workers in New York and found higher average levels of psychopathy than in the general population, so higher than most adults. But they also found 7% of these people, in other words 4 out of 55, were in the top 2.5% of the psychopathy measure. In other words, you'd count those as very highly psychopathic indeed. They also found lower levels of emotional intelligence, which is what you'd expect from a psychopathic sample because of this emotional deficit that they have. And they also found higher ranks and higher incomes correlating with higher levels of psychopathy. So again, this goes back to our theory that there are more of them at the top than there are at the bottom, because they've got higher ranks and they've got higher incomes. So it relates to what Hare found. The higher up the military you go in these human rights violators, the more psychopathic they are. I did a similar study with a student, I should say, to the one in New York, but the person I did it with actually worked in the City of London, and they refused to let me publish the results. So, but again, I think I'm safe in saying they were higher than average levels of psychopathy. And the third set of, a third set of evidence is that I looked at the reactions on the Bloomberg site to the discussion of my theory, the corporate psychopath theory of the global financial crisis. And there was about a few hundred comments underneath it. And of those who expressed an opinion, the ratio in favour of accepting the theory was about just over 6 to 1. So in other words, people thought it was perfectly sensible theory. At the time, back in 2011, academics were a lot less supportive, if that's the right word. Financial insiders thought that I was just stating a common sense finding, something they already knew. Academics thought I was being ridiculously radical in stating that there are psychopaths in the corporate sector. This is a quote from a lady who researches sustainability, and she's just calling for a better type of leadership as we stand on the tipping point of environmental catastrophe and unsustainability. I'll take questions at the end, which will be in a minute, I think. So one of the things that's always said to be higher, more likely under psychopathic political leadership is the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. So, for example, someone referring to Saddam Hussein said he would have had no hesitation in using them if he'd had them. He used chemical weapons, for example, against the Kurds. So more chance of nuclear war, less chance of corporate social responsibility and economic sustainability. more chance of financial crises reoccurring. And I think that's basically it. If you want more information, and I've given you, there's a talk on corporate psychopaths and bullying, which if you've never been bullied, it won't mean anything to you. But if you have been bullied, you probably empathise with what I'm saying there. There's also a documentary called The Psychopath Next Door. Unfortunately, there's also an American TV series called The Psychopath Next Door. I'd recommend the documentary, but not the TV series. And I have a couple of books on the subject. One's called The Climate of Fear, Stone Cold Psychopaths at Work, because they always create this climate of bullying and abuse and fear. And they do that so that they can get on with their self-oriented agenda without people daring to challenge what they're doing. And then Corporate Psychopaths, Organizational Destroyers is really the book of my first thesis. And it's, because it's an academic book, it's too expensive for most people. But everybody under the age of 30 seems to be able to download it from the internet for free. So, whereas one or two, usually when I talk to 100 people, one person buys my Climate of Fear book, so I get £3 out of these talks. So thank you very much. I will take questions if anybody's got them.
Have a microphone, so please put your hand up if you have a question. You have people on a live stream as well. So.
I'm wondering if you've got all these psychopaths at the top of an organisation, how are they reacting to one another? One taking on another, you know, it seems that that level of arrogance, you wouldn't want that kind of competition, but that clearly isn't the case.
Well, that's sort of less studied, but I think they tend to clump together because like attracts like. So there's been some research into Trump supporters, for example, and those with, have you heard of the dark triad personality? So Machiavellian, narcissistic, and psychopathic. They tend to like strong man leaders. In other words, dark leaders attract dark followers. So yeah, as I say, like attracts like, it seems.
I wanted to ask you what you saw happening between Zelensky, Vance, and Trump.
Sorry, I didn't...
What did you see? What did you see when you saw Zelensky, Trump, and Vance in the White House?
Oh, well, one of Trump's... The person who ghostwrote The Art of the Deal describes Trump as a frightened child. So I think we saw a childish and very narcissistic reaction to what was happening, and it was very impressive. I was hoping you wouldn't say that.
I was going to ask about the choice facing humanity. It doesn't seem like humanity's really chosen against leaders like this in the past, and I'm not sure it's going to do it in future. And in particular, because all the incentives are set up. I mean, I couldn't help but think while you were talking about shareholder value maximization, that's the perfect excuse. I mean, I've had people talk to me about maximizing shareholder value, and that's an excuse to throw your morality out the window. So when the entire system is set up that way, and psychopaths are good at getting into leadership, what hope is there that we're going to make the right choice or make a different choice?
Well, on the face of it, not much, but we have to get better, as I said, at selecting our leadership and making sure that we understand the implications of voting for or moving into senior organizational leadership positions, those who have dark personalities, because the result is always destructive. So either we appoint caring leaders who are going to look after us and the future, or the alternative is quite bleak.
How do you find out if someone is a psychopath? Is their like emotional intelligence so low that they don't understand that like answering a question a certain way is going to make them seem like a horrible person?
Yeah, because of this emotional deficit they have, which seems to be linked to their brain activity, they understand emotions at an intellectual level, but not at a feeling level, not at an affective level. So they can mimic emotions, but they don't really get it. And therefore, one of the ways that you might potentially spot them is that lack of responsiveness. So they won't have the normal degree of reciprocity and give and take in relationships that you'd otherwise expect. Does that answer? Yeah.
You've talked a lot about the negative sides of being a psychopath and how damaging it can be. Are there any kind of positive things where maybe a leader who's a psychopath can actually benefit making a decision or something in some way?
Yeah, I mean, there's a psychologist called Kevin Dutton who argues that you can turn up and down your levels of psychopathy, and that in some situations it would be beneficial to be more psychopathic than others. And he gives the example of being a surgeon, for example, who tend to have slightly higher levels of psychopathy. So with a surgeon, you don't want them so sensitive that they start crying once they slice you open. But on the other hand, you do want them sensitive enough to care whether you live or die while you're under the knife. So his argument, I think, is a bit fallacious, because at the extreme levels of psychopathy, everything is always negative. So this idea that you can turn it up and down like a dial. So he's written a book called, what's it called? He writes about successful psychopaths, in other words. But other psychologists, like a woman called Stout, strongly disagrees with what Kevin Dutton says.
Hi. At the start of your talk, you showed us some pictures of some brain images linked to psychopathy. Is there any sort of treatment, sort of more physiological treatments being developed that you could speak about?
Well, no, the consensus of opinion seems to be that psychopaths are not really treatable, because it's such an established personality. It starts in childhood and it goes all the way through the rest of your life, basically. But you've just reminded me of something. I talked about King John earlier. There was a neuroscientist in America called James Fallon, who became an expert at recognizing psychopathic brains from brain scans. And he'd usually throw in a few non-psychopathic brain scans just as a control variable. And he was going through these brain scans one day, and he found one brain scan that was definitely, without doubt, psychopathic. And when he looked up the code for the brain scan, it was his brain. But interestingly, he traces his lineage back to King John, who was one of our worst kings in history in the UK. And also, some members of his family were serial killers as well. So it looks like it's gone down through the generations to him. And just an interesting observation.
I'm just wondering why psychopaths go to the top, because if they treat their team so badly, you'd expect it to be an underperforming team, an underperforming organization. you'd expect them to get caught out somehow. And so I'm just wondering why none of that seems to happen.
Basically, it's because they're so good at upward impression management that they can cook the books and manage the image long enough to stay in position for enough years for them to get what they want out of it. And quite often, I think once they've got that, they'll move on to their next organisation and do the whole thing over again. There was a qualitative case we looked at in London where the guy was already earning $250,000 a year, which for most of us would be quite satisfying. And the HR director became suspicious of him and got a forensic accountant to investigate. And they found in the end, after much deliberation, that he was siphoning off close to £1 million on top of that already. So he is one of the few people that did end up in jail that I found in my own research. But the interesting thing there was when she first reported her suspicions to the global board of directors, their first reaction was, no, you're jealous. You're jealous of his success. He's one of our star employees. We're about to promote him to the world board level. So they're so good at, and all his success was based on the work of his one of his juniors. And so they claim the good work of other people as their own and use people to do what they should be doing because they're promoted beyond their abilities to do the job because they don't, this guy, the fraudulent guy, on paper he had a Harvard MBA, but in reality he had something like an unfinished plumbing qualification. So his whole image and reputation was based on lies to begin with. And again, this goes back to proper CV checking and reference checking and finding out who you're really employing. So they get away with it because they're so good at lying, they're so good at claiming the work of other people, and they're so good at giving an upward image.
If your boss, you think, is a corporate psychopath, what strategy would you recommend for taking them on?
Well, most psychologists say get the hell out of there. It's the best, which isn't always particularly useful. I mean, don't confront them on your own. Always make sure you meet them at least in pairs, like Trump's lawyers do, so that they can catch him out when he's lying. So, and if you can, don't be a direct threat to what they're doing because they can turn very nasty very quickly. So the guy I was talking about just then, when his junior manager, who he'd unveiled in the fraud, unknowing to him, when he found out about it, he threatened to expose the psychopath, and the psychopath said that he'd kill his children if he did that. So be very careful in dealing with them. Gather as much evidence as you can, so every time you see someone being abused or bullied or sexually harassed, note the time, the date, who was there, who saw it, who witnessed it, and gather a portfolio of evidence. Usually there'll be multiple victims of this person, so multiple sexual harassments or multiple bullying and bullying from male psychopaths anyway. The bullying will be very overt and open and in front of other people, less so with female psychopaths, but it's a case of gathering enough evidence, and then you've got the job of trying to persuade those above them that they're not as good as they think they are, and that's the hard part. The other thing is, of course, that HR are notoriously bad at dealing with these situations, so they nearly always take the side of the management rather than the bullied individual. And so from the bullied person's point of view, HR always fail. I did a recent study on this, sort of an ethnographic study, not a single person had a single good thing to say about HR, which I'd never done HR research before, so I found it quite appalling. I was shocked. I spoke to a HR professor when I was in a conference in Australia, and he said, no, that's quite standard. That's what we expect out of HR people, which was terrible. The good news, of course, is that most of us are not psychopathic, and we do care about other people. Sorry, you were looking so disappointed. I thought I should point out some of the plus points of humanity. Yes.
Is there any advantage, evolutionary back in time, to having a certain number of psychopaths within a group of humans?
I honestly don't know the answer to that. Evolutionary psychologists will tell you that they propagate themselves by what's called a fast life strategy. So they have multiple liaisons with multiple women, and they have multiple children that they don't know about or don't care about, and just go from relationship to relationship in that sort of uncaring way. So that's how they pass on their genetic code to down the generations. I can't see many advantages of having them, except that it gives us something to fight against, something to contrast our own good behaviour against. So maybe that's an element of spiritual growth that we can gain from it. I'm grasping at straws here.
You talk about psychopaths and bullying. Is there any evidence of them going any further than just bullying? And what sort of distinguishes them from like serial killers and serious violence?
They bully frequently and often and openly. I mean, it's quite. I worked with the professor of statistics in Australia, and from our first study, we reckoned that our measure of bullying didn't capture fully the frequency and severity of what we were looking at, because normally we just use these little scales, but their bullying is way off the scale. And as I say, it's particularly nasty. So in one book I read, the psychopath seemed to have worked his way through sexually harassing nearly every female in his department. So there was a constant turnover of junior females, and the new ones wouldn't last long because of the same thing happened to them. And in the end, the only reason the firm took notice of what was happening was because one of the women sued the company for what had happened to her. So it's only, companies don't seem to care unless there's going to be some sort of financial disadvantage for them. So I think going back to your question, probably the best way to catch them is because they're so enmeshed in fraud, that will be the way to get them. And there was a CEO of a national health trust who was particularly nasty, and in the end, fraud was her undoing, rather than the bullying and abuse that she was dishing out to people. Right, on that positive note.
Sorry, one more.
Oh, right.
Hi. On the passing down of the psychopathy, you talked about it where it's a lot not just who the
Sorry,
parent...
I'm a little bit deaf. You'll have to shout.
Okay. Oh, sorry. So on passing down the psychopathy, you talked about one of the females in there, and you talked about how it was also very important the fact that the environment that she grew up, she also suffered a lot. Is it psychopathy needs like genetics and nurture, or can it be watered down if it's only like genetics and at one point it will kind of disappear out of the line?
Yeah, there seems to be a strong genetic element, but in theory, if you were born as an orphan, say, and you ended up in an orphanage where you got no human contact, nobody touched you, nobody gave you any affection, then that would starve you of your emotional responsiveness, and you might end up as it would be a socialized kind of psychopathy. So the more correct word for that would be sociopathy rather than psychopathy. And similarly, if you were born, say, into a criminal family where your family was a family of hitmen or killers, then you'd be socialized into that form of sociopathy. But theoretically, you'd still have a conscience, whereas psychopaths don't have any conscience because of this lack of emotional reactivity in their brain. And so you could appeal to the conscience of someone who had been socialized in that way and explain to them that killing people wasn't actually a good thing to do. So it's a mixture of environment and genetics, but genetics does seem to be important. Okay, well, thank you. Oh.